being here today. Right, so today is going to be the day we've had many presentations and talks in this building. Inshallah, this will be the last one. Okay. So I just want to say thank you very much for everyone for being here today. I really appreciate it. Tahseem, I wanted to just say a little bit about Tahseem being here before I read out his bio. So one of the objectives of the Center for those who are online and are not here in person is that the Center's objective is not only to have academics who are doing Islamic studies or various fields in the field of Islamic studies to come and be participants in the Center. The Center also is trying to encourage people who do traditional studies in the field of Ulumuddin in of itself, right? And those of you who are here today have been Ilahiyat students, so you sort of understand the sort of like approach that we have at Ilahiyat, which is to encourage not only academics but students from the background of Ulumuddin. And so I was really pleased that Tahseem sort of accepted our invitation to give a presentation on his new book, which you mentioned today, because I think that's one of the objectives of the Center itself, right? In that sense of trying to bring over scholars from around the world who are not only affiliated to Western academia. So Tahseem Khan was born and raised in Philadelphia. He completed his renowned Dars al-Islamic curriculum mainly through private in-person studies under numerous authorized Islamic scholars. He is also a lecturer in Islamic systematic theology at the prestigious Dar al-Islam Seminary in Chicago. And it's really wonderful to have somebody from the Chicago area as a way of also creating those connectivities to the various seminaries that exist in Chicago. He currently resides with his family in the suburbs of Chicago while working full-time as a chemical engineer. I thought that was important because those of you who know me at the Ilahiyat know that I did business computing for my undergraduate degree here as a multimedia student. So things are still possible. And he's pursuing an advanced studies in Islamic theology under the tutelage of these teachers. So Tahseem, the floor is yours. Thank you very much once again for everyone being here and those who are online.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So I'm very delighted to be here. I'd like to express my utmost gratitude to Istanbul University and to Dr. Yaqub in particular for giving me this wonderful opportunity to discuss a little bit about, and I say a little bit because the book that I was, alhamdulillah, able to publish back in Ramadan is around 155 pages. It was very difficult for me to put the contents of that book into just a 45-minute PowerPoint presentation. Nevertheless, my goal is to go over some of the salient features of the book, and inshallah we can get started. So as with anything, whenever you have a dialectic going on, an exchange between two people, in order to further the discussion, it's necessary that you have an agreed upon premise, what we can call a musallam, that which we are in agreement between ourselves. The only premise that I ask the reader of my book to come to bring to the table is that he or she believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that Allah is beyond, transcendent beyond any blemishes of any sort, and that He revealed His inimitable Quran, His mu'jiza, to the trustworthy and truthful servant Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, to differentiate as a furqan between what is true and what is false. This is the only premise. Overview, we'll start off with an introduction, followed by a little bit about supernatural events and empirical methods. From there, we'll go straight into speaking about a very relevant verse. In my opinion, it's the most relevant verse in the Quran regarding the creation of Adam alayhi salam. We'll talk about the reason for the revelation of that verse, followed by the context of that verse, and then we'll wrap things up and then end with a conclusion. Impact of the theory of evolution on theology. One of the things that I quickly realized during the study, the research phase of my book, is that the theory of evolution has had a global impact on the Muslim community. Oftentimes what I found was that believing in the theory of evolution such that one would believe that Adam ﷺ had a pair of biological parents was seen as something intellectually elite. Whereas holding on to the traditional belief that Adam ﷺ did not have parents was seen as being backwards, as being dogmatic, as being somebody who just blindly accepts the faith. And so this dichotomy between the intellectual elite and those who are considered to be just believers in dogma is something that I quickly realized in the research phase of my book. And then from there, I wanted to see if the contradiction between what is being said here can be reconciled. Oftentimes we see in science versus religion, some things can be reconciled within the larger field of science and religion. And I wanted to see if here it's possible that the contradiction between affirmation of parents for Adam alayhi salam versus having no parents was reconcilable. And unfortunately, I came to the conclusion that it's not reconcilable, as you can clearly see the affirmation of one thing and simultaneously to contradict that same thing is a true contradiction. Scientific evidence versus scriptural evidence. I'm very consolidating everything I wrote in my book here to just surmise, to say that eventually it becomes a matter of weighing the evidence. What is science saying? What weight, what truth value do we assign that? And then what are the nusus, the Quran and Sunnah, saying regarding this same matter? And what kind of weight do we assign to that particular evidence? But and so it becomes a dichotomy between what is qat'iyyu dalala and qat'iyyu thubut versus what is dhaniyyu dalala and dhaniyyu thubut. In other words, the difference between what is speculative, probabilistic, versus that which is decisive. But it can never be the case where the Quran is saying something in decisive terms, and science, on the other hand, is saying something also in decisive terms, and the two contradict one another. And this is because, as you can see the verse in the Quran here, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Do they not reflect on the Quran? Had it been from anyone other than Allah, they would have certainly found in it many inconsistencies. And so the ulama derive from this ayah that it can never be the case that the Quran is saying something in decisive terms, and that is at odds with what science is saying also in decisive terms. One of the two must be probabilistic or dhaniyyu dalala or dhaniyyu thubut in what they're conveying. One of the things about philosophical naturalism, which is a certain type of philosophy that science upholds, is that all of knowledge can be found within scientific investigation. And at odds with this particular philosophy is what the people of religion, or here in particular, Ahl Sunnah, specifically the Mutakaddimun, is they state, if you're familiar with the ahkam aqliyya, the rational judgments that are given to anything, they say that so long as a particular thing falls within the mumkinat, or what is termed as the possible, by virtue of looking at the essence of that thing, in light of the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of identity, then so long as that thing is from the mumkinat, then the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the omnipotence, is applicable to that thing. So here the question becomes, also to state that it's important to state that in addition to the qudra applying to the possible category, the mumkinat category, we also believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-fa'il al-mukhtar, someone possessing will or irada. And this we can give two reasons for this. One is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself mentions in the Quran, وَرَبُّكَ يَخْلُقُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيَخْتَارُ مَا كَانَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ. Your Lord creates and chooses whatever He wills. The choice is not theirs. And then Imam al-Sanusi mentions a very beautiful point in that if we take a look at the world and we see the properties of things that we find in the world, then what we realize very quickly is that any given property that we observe in the world, it could have been another property in place of that one. And the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specified that this thing be associated with this property shows that He has willpower, shows that He has qudra. And so if you combine these two aspects, one is what we said in the previous slide, that so long as the thing is from the mumkinat, and we combine that with knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-fa'il al-mukhtar, a freely willing agent, then what we can come to as a conclusion is that the possibility, the imkaniyya, the possibility of a miracle is there. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so long as He is a freely willing agent, which He is, combined with the fact that the matter of discussion is from the mumkinat, then the possibility of a miracle will always be there. And so we apply this concept to the question of, is it possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to create a human without a pair of biological parents? Then the rational judgment would be that this thing, i.e. a human being created from without any parents, is from the mumkinat. And because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a freely willing agent, then the possibility that, remember, here we're only speaking about the possibility, the imkaniyya. The possibility remains that a human can in fact be created without a pair of biological parents. And in this regard, in this same vein, we have the case of Isa alayhi salam, who was, according to Christians, Jews, Muslims alike, was created without a biological human father. And so if we want to put this into Arabic logic terms, into mantiqi terms, that the case of Isa alayhi salam will function as the salida juz'iyya, or the particular negative of the universal that science seeks to uphold, that all humans are a product of a pair of biological parents. Remember, science does not concern itself with particulars. Science does not concern itself with juz'iyyat. Science looks to construct a universal, a kulliyya. And in this particular vein, the kulliyya, the universal that science is looking to uphold, is the one right here, that all humans must possess a pair of biological parents. This is something that I include in my book. It is a diagram here that I derived from Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri Effendi, where he speaks about what do empirical methods convey. And if we look at the scope of existence, the diagram on your left, versus the scope of non-existence, the circles on your right, then what you'll find here is that starting with the diagram on the left, you have three concentric circles. The outer circle represents the imkan circle, all of which is possible. Within that large circle, you have a smaller concentric circle that represents the wuqu' circle, or that which has actually occurred. And then inside of that, you have a smaller circle, which is the darura, or that which must be occurring. And so what you see here
And then on the right side, of your right side in that diagram, you have the larger concentric circle, which is the la wuku circle, and then inside of that you have the istihala. So the larger circle is that which has not occurred, and then inside that you have that which cannot occur, meaning that which is impossible. And so if you look at science, what Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri is saying is that if you look at empirical investigations, empirical methods, they only concern themselves with the la wuku category, meaning our scientific investigation has concluded that this thing is not present. Or, on the other hand, the wuku category, that our experimentation here has concluded that this thing, X, is present. But in order for science to make a judgment in the imkan field, or the darura field, or the istihala field, then a function of the mind, an intellection, needs to be used to pass that judgment. Empirical methods alone cannot arrive at a judgment regarding those other scopes. You can only make a judgment. This is very crucial and very important. And it clashes with the overall philosophical naturalism that is rampant and prevalent within the scientific community. Another very important thing to keep in mind is that we often hear many people within the Muslim community, even among scholars, is to say that the entire theory of evolution is invalid, and science in general, there's a very skepticism that is often projected onto science. However, this is unlike what we find in books of logic, in Arabic logic, ancient books of logic, books that were studied within the classical curriculums of Islamic madaris across the Muslim world. For example, in every Arabic logic book, there's a section on istiqra, or inductive reasoning, and as well as tajriba, as well as something called hadith. But here we'll speak more importantly about tajriba and istiqra. And essentially, what these Arabic books of logic are saying is that so long as you have an underpinning rationale that supports your empirical findings, then what this will convey is something that is certain, that is yaqini. So it's not the case, contrary to how many people project, it's not the case that whatever science is saying is automatically dhanni or probabilistic. Rather, science can, at times, yield certainty. And so if we use this, because this is from our own heritage, from our own books that we use and we teach and we learn from, if we apply this to the particular issue at hand, which is the creation of Adam alayhi salam without parents, or more broadly speaking, the fact that every human that we meet is a product of biological parents, then what we can conclude here is that evolutionary science yields gnomic certainty. Gnomic certainty means adatan, or adi. What do we normally find? What we normally find is that every single human that we've ever met, you and I, has been a product of the reproduction of two biological parents. And then moreover, on top of this, the theory of evolution, and then evolutionary science, genetics, and many other fields have reached a confluence in that we know exactly why a human must be a product of two biological parents. If you study even basic genetics, you would understand why that's necessary. And so if we put all of that data and information together, what that yields is actual certainty. Gnomic certainty, though, in that it is wajib adatan, that every single time we come across a human, that human is a product of a male and a female of biological parentage. And we should never be in doubt, as is very evident, that whenever we come across a human, we don't think to ourselves, is it just a mother or just a father, we intuitively know that this individual before us is a product of both male and female. And so the ruling, even according to Arabic logic, would be that it is wajib al-adli. It is nomically certain that every single human must possess a pair of biological parents. So the hukam, the judgment given, would be that all humans must possess a pair of biological parents. And this will constitute a dalil, an evidence, and will remain as a hujjah, as an evidence. And the only thing that can overturn this evidence is by something that is of weightier evidence, whose evidence is stronger than what we found here. So for example, in order to overturn this gnomic certain belief that every single human must possess a pair of biological parents, we must have an unequivocal evidence, something that's qat'i al-dalal and qat'i al-thubut, to the contrary, meaning to the contrary, that all humans must possess a pair of biological parents. The mere rational possibility is not sufficient to overcome this gnomic certainty judgment. Remember, I just like to stress on that. Just because rationally speaking we can understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create a human without biological parents is not enough to trump the gnomic certainty that we have reached here that all humans must possess a pair of biological parents. So from here, the question becomes, do we have that evidence? And so now we're going to transition from speaking about imkaniyya, the possibility of a human being created without parents, to the actual wuqu', or the actual occurrence. Did it occur in the case of Adam alayhi salam, or did it not occur? And in this regard, I want to share it's something that I found out very quickly, the dilemma that I encountered. When somebody asked me, a Muslim who believes in the theory of evolution, who believes that Adam alayhi salam had parents, he asked me one time, what is your proof from the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam alayhi salam without parents? And so I told him, I recounted the story when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks Iblis, why did you not prostrate to Adam alayhi salam? And then it's mentioned, وَخَلَقَتَهُ مِنْ طِينٍ, that you created him from clay. And so I said, clearly, if Adam alayhi salam is made from clay, he did not have parents. And this Muslim evolutionist replied to me by saying, then what do you say about the ayah, which is the second one, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن طِينٍ, that he is the one who created you, in the plural, also from طين, from clay. In other words, could it have not been the case that just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He created you from clay, meaning your origin is from clay, then in that same manner He created Adam alayhi salam by way of biological parents, but that his origin is also from clay. And so this created a big dilemma in my mind of how to overcome this rebuttal. What I found is something interesting. As is very obvious to us, if you take somebody from the East, you take somebody from the West, you take a child, you take an adult, if you ask any Muslim, for centuries, if you were to ask any Muslim, did Adam alayhi salam have parents? He will say, no. This is an accepted consensus. So Imam al-Juwayni, Imam al-Haramayn al-Juwayni, he mentions in one of his works that when you have a large consensus, such as this one, when you have a very large consensus on something within the deen, then it must be the case that the basis for that consensus, the mustanad, the basis for that consensus, must be something very decisive, such that it is a unifying cause, that it was such a strong basis states that it resulted in this large consensus. And then he also states that what oftentimes happens is that when you have a large consensus, and that particular consensus goes uncontested, then whenever somebody is asked about that particular issue, why is this, they will just invoke the consensus as the justification. And so what happens is the mustanad, the basis for that consensus, is no longer stated. Because there's no real reason to state it, because it was never contested. And when I read this, I thought to myself that this is probably what has occurred with the belief that Adam alayhi did not have parents. The fact that so many people are in agreement that he did not have parents means that the mustanad, the basis of this belief, must be very decisive. But people have dropped stating that explicitly because it was never contested until the theory of evolution came along, until Darwin came along. So now the question that needs to be asked is, what is that decisive evidence that became that unifying cause for this large consensus? And that was what my research was looking to determine. What is that decisive unifying cause? One of the things that I found from the books of Usul al-Tafsir is that they mentioned that there are three things that you have to look into when explicating the Quranic ayah. One is the sabab al-nuzul, the reason for the revelation of that verse, followed by the context of that verse, and then another thing called qarinatul aql, that the rational indicative tool. And we'll get into that in just a moment. The ayah right here at the very top, إِنَّ مَثَلَ عِيسَى عِنْدَ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلِ آدَمَ خَلَقَهُ مِنْ تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. In my opinion, I believe this is the single most relevant verse. In fact, it is that decisive unifying cause that Imam al-Haramain was speaking about with regards to proving that Adam alayhi salam could not have had parents. If you look at the sabab al-nuzul of this ayah, the reason for the revelation of this ayah, it occurred when the Christians of Najran came to Medina al-Munawwara and they asked the Prophet ﷺ about Isa alayhi salam. And they asked the Prophet ﷺ, who is the father of Isa alayhi salam? Implying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the father, na'udhu billah. And so as a result of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the father, they believed that the son would also be divine. And so they asked, when the Prophet ﷺ negated the divinity of Isa alayhi salam, he was asked, then who is the father? And the Prophet ﷺ became silent. And then the first 80 verses of Surah Al-Imran were revealed unto him, amongst which is this ayah, verse number 59. So that sets the stage of why this ayah was revealed. Remember, if this ayah was revealed because the Prophet ﷺ was asked regarding how to negate the divinity of Isa alayhi salam because he did not have a father. That is to say, they believed that he was divine because of not having a biological father. So that's a very important and key thing to keep in mind. From here, if we look at the context of where this verse comes in, within the 80 verses that were revealed at once, what we find is that there's a continuous theme that is used in the first 80 verses of the Quran. And I listed it over here. All of these verses found in the first 80 verses of the Quran seek to negate the divinity of Isa alayhi salam and to uphold the sole divinity belonging to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So this is the context of the first 80 verses of the Quran. And from here I want to speak about something that is very important here, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran an ayah is known as the tahaddi verses of the Quran, the challenging verses of the Quran, where he says, فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ, then produce a surah like it. At-Taftazani, in his Mukhtasar al-Ma'ani, and many other scholars mention that this verse, what can be derived from this verse is that it cannot be the case that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is challenging the Qurayshi Arabs to produce something like that, the Quran, in terms of its balagha, in terms of its eloquence, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself is not baligh, is not eloquent in the Quran itself. Again, it cannot be the case that Allah asks others to be eloquent, to produce something like that, the Quran, while Allah himself is not being eloquent in the Quran. Rather, it must be, rationally speaking, it must be the case that every ayah, in fact, Imam al-Tahseem mentions that every word that Allah is far beyond including even one ineloquent word in the Quran because of this ayah. And so, if we look from here, what we can conclude is that any tafsir that results in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using a word that is ineloquent, that tafsir has to be negated. It has to be invalidated. Any tafsir that is given to a word or a sentence in the Quran that does not live up to the principles and the standards of what is known as baligh, or what is known as eloquent, according to the rules of Arabic language, cannot be the correct tafsir for that ayah. Very quickly, we must know what it means by Arabic eloquence, or something to have balagha. Balagha, according to the scholars of lugha, of Arabic language, it must include everything that is known as fasaha, which is the first three things mentioned here. It must be devoid of weakness in composition, phonetic incompatibility, and lexical semantic incompatibility. And this last line right here is the most crucial thing. In order for anything to be baligh, it must conform to the dictates and requirements of the context, what is known as al-mutabaqa bi muqtada al-hal, which basically means that it must, the verse, the explanation of that verse, must conform to the context of that verse. Any tafsir that you're giving to an ayah that does not reflect in conforming to what the context demands cannot be eloquent. And so if you take the reason for the revelation of the verse, that the Christians of Najran were using the fact that Isa alayhi salam did not have a biological father to make a case for him being divine. And you combine that with the fact that verse number 59 is sandwiched between verses that are seeking to negate divinity for Isa alayhi salam, then if you combine those two qarinas, what you come up with is that the muqtada al-hal, that which is required to be in conformity with the context, is that the ayah, the tafsir of the ayah, must cogently prove that the absence of biological paternity in the case of Isa alayhi salam does not merit a case for his divinity. Any tafsir that you give for verse 59 must prove that not having biological parentage in the case of Isa alayhi salam does not mean that he's divine. It must refute this notion. If you look at the structure, the structure being used in verse 359, Inna mathala Isa, mathala is that of simile, or tashbih. And what you can quickly, if I wanted to compare if you apply it to the ayah, what you will see is that in terms of balagha, the mushabba, which in English they term as the tenor, the mushabba being Isa alayhi salam is being compared to Adam alayhi salam. And if you look at this structure, in order, and keep in mind that this verse was revealed at a time where the Christians of Najran were challenging the Prophet ﷺ. And the debate became so intense that some of the Mufassirun said that the Prophet ﷺ said that he wished a barrier would come up between him and the Christians of Najran because of the heated exchange he was having with them. And so what you come to know here is that the objective of the verse, or the gharab, the objective of the verse 59 being used here, the simile, the tashbih, is one to try to refute the belief of the Christians. And the scholars of Balagha mention that whenever you have a situation where you're trying to refute someone, then it must be the case that you must do it with a comparison that is more complete and more known in the minds of the listener than what is being challenged. So Isa alayhi salam, on one hand, must be compared to Adam alayhi salam in a similarity where Adam alayhi salam is more well known for that trait and is more complete in that trait. It cannot be the case, and even rationally if you think about this, it cannot be the case that somebody is challenging you about something, and you use an example as a form of evidence, and that example is not even known to the individual, to your interlocutor. Rather, it must be the case that you bring forth something that is more apparent in the mind of the listener, in the mind of the one that you're interacting with. And so here, very quickly, this is a table that I use in my book. According to this, if you take everything what the scholars of Balagha have mentioned, and you look at the context of where this verse was revealed, then what occurs is that the similarity between Adam alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam, it must be something that pertains to how he was created. Why? Because the verse says, خَلَقَهُ مِنْ تُرَابٍ. And then furthermore, it cannot be new information. Because if there was new information, it would not be known to the listener. So it must be information that is not new. And so this refutes those Muslim evolutionists who say that perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was trying to reveal something about the theory of evolution through this ayah. Rather, it cannot be that case. It cannot be as such. It has to be something that was already known and well known to the listeners of that time. Moreover, it must be more renowned in the case of Adam alayhi salam than in the case of Isa alayhi salam. It must be more complete in the case of Adam alayhi salam versus what is found in the case of Isa alayhi salam. And it must be something that refutes the concept that just because you have an absence of parentage, that means you're divine. It must refute this. And the only thing that fits this criteria that I've culled from books of Balagha is that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents, which was a widely held belief at that time between Christians and Muslims alike. I asked leading professors of Christian theology in the Western academia world. It's something that I detailed in my book. I named the professors that I consulted with. These are subject matter experts. That was the belief that Isa alayhi salam, or was the belief that rather Adam alayhi salam not having parents widely known amongst the Christian community, such that the Christians of Najran would know this. And they said that there's a consensus that amongst early Christians that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents. So this was a widely held belief amongst the Christian community even back then. And it's the only thing that fulfills all these criteria. And so as a result of that, it must be the case that what is being compared, the similarity between Adam alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam here, must be the case that it was the fact that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents that makes him more complete in that feature than Isa alayhi salam, because Isa alayhi salam had a mother, whereas Adam alayhi salam did not have a mother or a father. And if Adam alayhi salam was not divine, then likewise to say that Isa alayhi salam is divine because he's missing a parent becomes invalidated. And so the verse proves to successful in refuting what the Christians of Najran leveled to the Prophet ﷺ. And if we were to put it in the form of a logical syllogism, it would look like this: that the first premise would be that if Isa alayhi salam lacks full parentage, like Adam alayhi salam, every human that lacks full parentage is still not divine. Therefore, Isa alayhi salam is likewise not divine. And so this is the overall meaning of this verse 359, which refutes the Christians of Najran, and any other tafsir that is given to this ayah would not fulfill the criterion for what has to be baligh or eloquent, and as such, the rational indicative device or the qarinatul aql would invalidate that tafsir. And in conclusion, what we can say is that the epistemic value that we derive through the qarinatul aql, that had it not been the case that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents, then it would result in inconsistencies applicable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he used a form of evidence that was not eloquent and not successful in refuting the Christians of Najran. And this is impermissible from what we know from the Musallam, from the first premise that we stated, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free and transcendent beyond any blemishes. And so that concludes my presentation. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much for your time. If there are any questions, feel free to ask.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
I guess my first question is, are you familiar with the theory that Adam had already been created and that there had been a type of humanoid species already existed on Earth at the time when Allah Azza wa Jal made the decision to make mankind in جاعل في الأرض خليفة؟ قال the angels أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء. And I guess the basis for the position that there had already been creation is that angels only know that which they've experienced. And so to that end, there had been an analogy for what I'm thinking of is a precedent. A precedent for them to say, you've already tried this and it resulted in chaos. The question with this point is that that he was chosen. So that perhaps they suggest this means he was chosen from existing creatures and beings, and that from there he was given aql, and he was from that point.
So this is a belief that I...
Can you just break down the question for me?
Sure. So the question was that, is it possible, I'm going to summarize, but is it possible that other humanoid species could have existed during the time of Adam alayhi salam, by virtue of the fact that the angels knew that the humans would spill blood and cause a lot of corruption on earth, and so the only way we would have known this is by observing perhaps another human species that were similar to Banu Adam, and the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that he chose Adam alayhi salam in the verse that he cited. And so the evidences that you've given are actually the evidences that people use today to uphold this belief. I personally do not adhere to that belief, and one of the main reasons why I have difficulty in upholding that belief is the fact that Adam alayhi salam is referred to as being Bashar. He is the father of mankind, and so if we allow the notion that other humanoid species were concurrent with Adam alayhi salam, how do we uphold the fact that he is the father of humanity? You could potentially, I've seen some ways where people give a more restricted definition to Bashar and Insan, that Bashar and Insan could be possibly just limited to Banu Adam, and that way you could resolve the the dilemma there. But I think this is a work in progress. I'm opposed to it, but I think if somebody can flesh out some of the inconsistencies that arise from upholding this belief, then perhaps it could be, something that is credible.
They've reconciled it. They've reconciled it by saying that perhaps it was an adjacent species. Let's say, for example, Neanderthal, and Beni Adam was from sapien. I think that's how. But I think you've largely done okay for the answer. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And adding to that, I can say there is different. There is two Quran. One is for soul and the other for spirit, ruh, and nafs. So humans have nafs, but when Allah created his spirit is ruh. So Adam was created, and then humanity descended from him. Also, I would like to say something about one thing you said about science. You said that philosophical naturalism does not accept supernatural events, but I now study philosophy of biology, and we know that biology is really different than natural sciences we know. It's very unique, and actually the emergence of the first living being, the first cell which is subject to biology is not known. No one can explain how it emerged on Earth. So it's a source of unknowability. It's not subject to science. We cannot know. So it is supernatural. Science does not always give certainty, but it forms our minds to study our universe we live in. And also, I believe that understanding of Quran changes with the accumulation of this knowledge. So I believe that an evolution theory merged with Islamic faith does not harm us Muslims, and the creation you told us seems very Christian to me. The evolution, as long as we believe that we accept that evolution is a tool of creation, is a kind of creation, and Adam is the first human being, it's okay for Muslims to accept it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned that, scientific evidence is not something that we throw out, and I made it a point to mention that. The fact that scientific evidence, in ancient books of logic, we find that the concept of inductive reasoning, empirical methods, can, as you mentioned and how I mentioned in the presentation, can yield certainty, it can be yaqeen. And in this regard, the fact that all humans must possess a pair of biological parents is certain. I do not deny the fact that every human must have a pair of biological parents. But here it's very important to keep in mind that the type of certainty here is what I indicated to be nomic certainty. In other words, what we nomically find, what we normally find in this world, is that every human must possess a pair of biological parents. But if we were to look at this matter strictly from a rational standpoint, meaning that we pose the question, is it possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to create a human without a pair of biological parents? And I'm sure you would agree and answer, of course.
Everything is possible.
Exactly. And so now the next question, after answering that first initial question about the imkaniyya of creating a human without biological parents, is, did this happen? Did this happen with regard in the case of Adam alayhi salam? And I showed by virtue of this verse that it cannot be the case that he had parents. Rather, it must be the case that he did not have parents. Now, after concluding this, does this mean then that the theory of evolution is wrong? No. The theory of evolution can be correct in many different things and is correct in many different things. The sheer amount of evidence to support that every human must have a pair of biological parents is enormous. And so we're not going to refute the entire science by virtue of one man, i.e. Adam and Islam, not having parents. I think it's perfectly logical for us to uphold that on a nomological scale, every human must have parabiological parents, adatan. But then, in the particular case of Adam and Islam, he did not have parents. I think it's perfectly logical for someone to uphold both of these beliefs. I don't see a contradiction between the two. Thank you for your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed the talk. I'm I was teaching here at Istanbul University. Right now I'm residing in Malaysia. My question is, a comment, a question. It seems to me from your presentation, your work is based mostly on to give a rational basis for a consensus among Muslims and even among Christians and Jews. There's a consensus that Adam did not have parents, right? In the past, such ideas, such claims against consensus usually were disregarded. They are just a matter of excommunication, either by dalala or takfir. But there was a point for this, because if you try to give a basis for a consensus, you basically shift the claims against consensus to a scientific reality. So you give a kind of credit to these ideas. So do you think there is that kind of risk if you try to give rational reasoning for a consensus that has been accepted about 14 centuries, and you give explanations for the counter-arguments, then you give actually credits to these ideas. So there is that kind of risk. What is your take on that? Also, since I'm not familiar with this area, with this field, I was wondering, because we know only a few people in Turkey who claim such ideas. When was it first claimed in the West among Muslims? We know a little bit about among Christians. This idea, this claim that Adam did not have parents. Who were the first people who claimed that?
So who were the first people who claimed that Adam did not have?
Did not, yeah. Among Muslims. Yeah, thank you.
So with the first question, who was the first to claim consensus?
Yeah.
In my research, I found many scholars claiming consensus. For example, Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi, who died in the 5th century Hijri, so maybe 1,000 years ago. He's one who claimed consensus that Adam did not have parents. The famous Mufassir Ibn Atiyah, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn al-Qayyim Jawziyah, Ibn al-Qattan, Al-Fasi, all these people predate the theory of evolution by hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's very clear that the claim of consensus is very old. It's not something that came after Darwin. It's something that, in fact, one of the things that we could actually even take it a little bit further. There's a so the hadith that says إن الله خلق آدم على صورته, that there's a lot of controversy about على صورته, that who does this pronoun, the ha in suratihi, return back to? One of the commentators, Ibn Furak, in his work on hadith, he mentions that one of the interpretations of this ayah is that the pronoun returns back to Adam alayhi salam in order to refute the dahriyah meaning that group who believe that every single human must possess a pair of biological parents. And so Ibn Furak, who lived 1,000 years ago, mentions that the Prophet ﷺ himself was actually refuting the Dahriya in this very belief that Adam Islam had to have had parents. So in fact, Ibn Furak makes a case that it was the Prophet ﷺ himself who was the first refuter of the belief that Adam Islam had parents. So this is very old. This is not something new.
I think I did not make myself clear. So the consensus is, for about 14 centuries, that Adam salam, did not have parents, correct? Among Muslims. So it claims, even though there was this Dahriya, the Muslim scholars did not pay attention to their claims. They did not give explanations. They just said, well, that is just balala, or they just applied takfir. So they did not try to base the consensus on some arguments. That's what I'm saying. So if there's a consensus, there is no need to defend it, because there is already established for 14 centuries for now. In the past, of course, less than that, but still, if there's a consensus, there is no need for explanation.
Right.
If you explain against the claims against the consensus, if you refute them, you basically take them into the field of science. So then you give them credit. You give them credit that, well, that's a kind of reasonable claim, and we have to refute it. So you give the credit, that kind of credit. So there is this risk in my view. What do you think about that? So in your role.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, and that risk can be present in other cases. But here, because of the fact that we know that every human must have a pair of biological parents, I felt that risk was very minimal. I mean, this is not something that we have witnessed every single human, every single person that we meet daily. We know that this individual is a result of a pair of biological parents. And so one of the things in my book, I was not trying to marginalize consensus and then therefore give credit, as you mentioned, to them for their scientific, for their science. Rather, I was trying to entertain the idea, just jadalan, just for argument's sake. If I can entertain what they're saying, and then look to see why our consensus is so large on this matter, and then derive a basis for it, then it will further actually support this consensus, right? If you can prove that the root or the basis of the consensus is strong, then it only further supports the consensus that is on top of it. And that is what the objective here was. It wasn't to give credit to them. I see what you're saying, that whenever you engage in something like that, you open the risk for that to occur. But I feel like even if that risk was there, I managed to close it by the end of the book.
Second question about Muslims in the West.
Second question.
So,
Muslims in the West who came up with the concept of started engaging with this theory of evolution.
so your second question was with regards to...
Who were the first advocates of this claim that Adam salam did not have parents in the West? This claim, who were the defenders, the first defenders among Muslims?
So the earliest refutation that I found from the Muslim community against the theory of evolution was written about 142 years ago. That was the earliest one I found from within the Muslim community. And so this is not something new. I'm sure I found Turkish authors, I found Egyptian authors, Egyptian scholars, Arab scholars, Indian scholars. Many people have written about this subject. It's not, I'm sure everybody here is well aware of that. But here, in my survey of the existing literature on the subject, refutations of the theory of evolution in support, in defense of Adam alayhi salam, I did not see anybody using this ayah in the way that I use it in my book here. I found people resorting to other ayat, or just simply stating, as you said, just invoking consensus and then just saying case closed. Consensus, according to us, is a valid form of proof. We don't need to give any more credence to what your science is saying. It is enough for us to say that this is a matter of consensus. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-qadir, al-murid, and then nothing more to add to that. But here, like I said, for the sake of argument, I wanted to pose this question and to entertain what science is saying, and then to see if we can bring forth a more weightier evidence. And the only premise that I ask is that the reader be a Muslim person who believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is transcendent beyond any flaws, and that the Quran is a literary miracle. If you believe that the Quran is a literary miracle, then you are compelled to uphold that every word, every sentence found in the Quran must meet the standards of what is baligh and what is eloquent. And if you try to reinterpret verse 359 in any other way, you will run the risk of not upholding that. And so the qarinatul aql, the rational indicative device, will tell you that this tafsir cannot be valid, or else you would be imputing things upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that cannot be the case.
Okay, we're going to call it to a close. I really wanted to first say thank you very much for the questions. They were quite robust, and I hope that they helped you in some way. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. So he has some of his books here if you're interested in going through. For as you know, he has written this book for Muslims, for Muslim audience in particular, so there is that in that sense. But once again, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate you coming to the centre and helping us out in that sense. And once again, asking you provocative thoughts for the writer who can go away and think about it. So thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum. Okay. How was that? I